They called her the most hated woman in Britain. Then they called her queen. But there is one title she was never promised, and one king who may not be able to save it for her. What happens inside the walls of a palace when love, loyalty, and royal law collide? The answer is more complicated than any headline has ever told you. There is a version of Camilla's story that the British press spent decades writing. It was not a kind version. It was built on stolen photographs, anonymous palace sources, and the grief of a nation that had watched Diana cry on television and never quite forgiven the woman believed to be the reason why. That version painted Camilla Parker Bowles as a villain, patient, calculating, quietly waiting in the wings while a fairy-tale marriage collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. For years, that was the story the public accepted. It felt clean. It had a clear hero and a clear villain, and it was, in almost every important way, far too simple to be true. The real story is messier. It always is. Charles and Camilla met in 1971 at a polo match, young and careless and drawn to each other in the way people are when they do not yet understand what it will cost them. She was funny. He was lonely. The royal machinery moved quickly. Charles left for a naval posting. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, and the moment passed, but it did not disappear. Over the decades that followed, through Charles's marriage to Diana, through the spectacular, painful public unraveling of that union, through Diana's death in a Paris tunnel in 1997, through all of it, Charles and Camilla remained close in a way that the palace could never fully explain, and the press could never quite forgive. When they finally married in April 2005, it felt less like a beginning and more like an ending. A long, exhausting chapter of hiding finally, formally closed. What followed surprised people. The woman who had been booed in the streets, who had endured 20 years of tabloid hatred, who had walked into her Windsor civil ceremony knowing that half the country wished she would not, that woman got to work. She showed up to engagements quietly, without fanfare. She took on charitable causes related to domestic abuse, literacy, and osteoporosis. She sat beside Charles at state dinners and handled awkward silences and difficult guests with practiced ease. Royal watchers began slowly to revise their assessments. The polls shifted. Camilla, it turned out, was rather good at this. Then came September 2022, and Queen Elizabeth II was gone. The world had known intellectually that this day would come. Knowing and feeling are different things. Within hours, Charles was king. Within those same hours, the question that had quietly shadowed Camilla's entire public life snapped back into focus with new urgency. What exactly was she now? The answer on paper was straightforward. She was queen consort. She was the wife of the king. She held one of the most senior titles in the British constitutional order. But the word consort carried weight. It was a reminder, deliberate or not, that her position was derived from his, that she had married into this, that she was not born to it. The palace, in a significant moment, quietly dropped the consort designation from the formal invitations to Charles's coronation in May 2023. The card read simply, King Charles III and Queen Camilla. It was a small typographical shift that landed like a statement. That coronation was a carefully choreographed event, but the politics swirling beneath its gilded surface were anything but orderly. The question of Camilla's title, not just what it was now, but what it would eventually become, was one that palace insiders understood to be unresolved in a fundamental sense. Royal protocol is clear on the mechanics. A queen consort is the wife of a reigning king. When that king dies, the consort's title changes. She does not become the monarch. She does not retain the same designation. She transitions under traditional royal convention to the title of Queen Dowager, a formal acknowledgement of her past status, not a continuation of it. It is the title the widow of a king holds. It is correct and appropriate, but it carries a different weight. It signals that her era has ended. The last time the British royal family had a Queen Dowager was in 1837, when King William IV died and his widow Queen Adelaide outlived him, stepping aside as his niece Victoria ascended the throne. Before that, the title existed, but was rarely invoked in modern conversation. Most people, hearing the words Queen Dowager, would not immediately recognize what they meant. And this is precisely where the tension lives, not in the legal definition, but in the human reality of what that transition represents for a woman who spent the better part of 3 decades working to be accepted as she is. The complicating factor, and there is always a complicating factor in royal succession, is Prince William. When Charles dies, William becomes king. And it is William, as the new monarch, who holds the practical power to shape what Camilla's life looks like in widowhood. Royal author Christopher Anderson has spoken at length about the relationship between Camilla and her stepson. The word he reaches for is tolerates. William tolerates Camilla. Camilla, for her part, is reportedly a little afraid of him. It is not a warm dynamic. It was never going to be. William was 12 years old when his parents separated, 14 when his mother died, and he grew up watching a woman who was deeply associated with that loss move steadily closer to his father, and ultimately to the throne his mother had occupied. Whatever intellectual understanding he may have developed as an adult, the emotional history is complicated and real. Reports from palace sources suggest that this tension has not evaporated with time and titles. In late 2024 and into 2025, as discussions about the monarchy's future direction continued behind closed palace walls, there were suggestions that William was quietly asserting himself in ways that went beyond his formal role as Prince of Wales. The former royal photographer Ian Pelham Turner, speaking to The Express, described a dynamic in which William appeared to believe he was already the driving force behind the throne, a perception Charles himself was reportedly pushing back against. Charles, according to Turner, was making clear to those around him that he was the king, not William, him. The phrase associated with these moments carries the unmistakable tone of a man drawing a line. It ends here. What this has to do with Camilla is not incidental. She is both a participant in the palace's internal politics and a subject of them. She has reportedly been one of Charles's key advisors in navigating the ongoing rift with Prince Harry, counseling her husband toward reconciliation, while William, who remains deeply hostile to Harry, has pushed in a different direction. Sources suggest Camilla supports a private father-son meeting between Charles and Harry, even as she plans to keep her own considerable distance from the Sussexes. This is a delicate position. She is caught between her loyalty to Charles, her difficult history with William, and the knowledge that whatever decisions are made now will shape her own future in the institution she has given 2 decades of careful work to rebuild her place in. Because her future under the protocols as they currently stand is not in her own hands. When Charles dies, whenever that day comes, Camilla will lose the title of queen in its active present-tense sense. She will become Queen Dowager. Whether she remains a working royal, whether she keeps her patronages, whether she stays in Clarence House or retreats permanently to Ray Mill House, her beloved private home in Wiltshire, where she already spends significant time, all of this will depend on the choices of the man who is simultaneously her stepson and the sovereign. Royal experts note that William could, theoretically, choose a different path. He could allow her to retain a modified version of her current title. He could grant her the Queen Mother designation, as Queen Elizabeth's mother was known. But this is considered highly unlikely, given that Camilla is not the biological mother of any future king, and given what palace observers describe as the perpetual chill in the William-Camilla relationship. What makes this story genuinely compelling, beyond the inevitable tabloid framing about power and loss, is what it says about the nature of royal life itself. Camilla spent decades wanting to be accepted. She was publicly humiliated, privately blamed for things that were far more complicated than blame could contain, and she endured it all with a kind of stoic dignity that gradually, against all odds, shifted public opinion in her favor. She became queen. She was crowned. She stood in Westminster Abbey in May 2023 and wore a crown that had been remade specifically for her. And still, the title is not hers in any permanent sense. It is borrowed. It is conditional. It depends on a man who loves her living long enough, and on a man who merely tolerates her choosing kindness over protocol when the time comes. There's a private meeting at the center of this story that no camera captured and no official statement confirmed. It is the kind of meeting that happens in the rooms that matter most behind closed doors, between people whose words will shape institutions and lives, with no press release to follow. What was said in those rooms about Camilla's title, about the future, about who holds power and who yields it? These are the questions that palace insiders are watching with considerable interest. Charles, by all accounts, remains deeply committed to Camilla. He fought for decades to be with her. He bent the will of Queen Elizabeth, renegotiated the public's tolerance, and outlasted the grief of a nation. He is not a man who gives up easily on the people he loves. But love and constitutional protocol are different languages, and even kings do not always get to choose which one governs the outcome. The title Camilla holds today is real. The work she has done to earn the public's grudging respect is real. The warm reviews from royal correspondents who once chronicled her with contempt are real. What remains unresolved, in the elegant, impossible way that so many things in the British royal family remain unresolved, is what happens next. What happens when the king who made her a queen is gone? What happens when the stepson who merely tolerates her has to decide how much of her dignity to protect? What happens when the woman who was once called the most hated in Britain is left to navigate a future where the title she carries is, once again, not quite what she once held, and the question of whether it ever really was returns to haunt the corridors of the palace she spent her life learning to call home?